Hello again, and welcome to the Working Class Movement Library series of Invisible Histories talks. Particularly, we welcome our speaker from afar, Francis Chu, who is forming a pleasingly appropriate US-UK link with us today to speak to us on the topic, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, Uncommon Sense for the 21st Century. Francis has written the Routledge Guidebook to Paine's Rights of Man, which came out last year. The library's events are, as usual, free. However, we would like, as usual, to encourage you to support us if you're able to do so. And there is a donate button on our website. So, Francis, over to you, and I will share my screen in one moment. Go back up to the top. There you go. Can everybody see that? Yeah?
Great.
Thank you. Over to you.
Okay. Well, should I just start off by saying why I wanted to write this book? Basically, what had happened was that I had been interested in Thomas Paine for a very, very long time. I guess probably just right before graduate studies. I was going to do a dissertation on William Blake, and he was actually one of the ones I was supposed to read. I have to admit that at that time I was not very enthusiastic about it because I thought, oh my God, Ronald Reagan loved Thomas Paine. He must be some disgusting conservative. And so then I started reading Rights of Man, Age of Reason, and Common Sense, and I was just completely floored by it. As it turned out, my thesis ended up not being on William Blake, but on the rise of supernatural fiction in the 18th century. And I actually worked with Marilyn Butler at Oxford. But yes, there's a strong UK-US connection here. Anyway, I was there for some years, and I had become increasingly interested in Paine. And then I think what really, really did it was probably in 2004, some years after I'd left Oxford, and I was reading John Keane's, well, actually, I was reading Roger Conway's biography of Paine, and I thought, no way, no one could be that idealist, no one could be that perfect. And so I read John Keane's biography, and I thought, oh my God, okay, he's got some warts, but he's still he was still an exceptionally bold, forthright, and I think honest writer. And I just thought I have, and then, I was thinking about everything that had happened to him. He had walked all the way from Trenton to Philly to get his American Crisis papers published. He walked in December. He joined the army, I think, actually before that. And he had made so many sacrifices. I thought, it's a real shame that Thomas Paine is not better known in the US. So I decided I was going to go teach a course on him, on Paine and his period. And this was back, I think, in 2006. I taught this course from about 2006 to about 2011. There was actually a variant of it in 2011. And then after that, Harvey Kaye, the great author of Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, recommended me to write this book for Routledge. And so that's how it came to be. But what really intrigued me about, this project was I wanted to know, everyone talks about Thomas Paine being really radical and everything, but I just wanted to know to know for myself, how radical was Paine, if you contextualize it in the history of the West, and how exactly did this idea of rights come about, for his time. So I went and plowed all the way back to the 12th century, starting with Gratian's Decretum. And I should mention here that I think most people probably have not heard of Gratian. And he was actually an Italian monk, and I think the founder of canon law. And he was one of the ones who thought that he basically stipulated that everyone had a right to maintain themselves, and that there's this idea of natural law, that people know that everyone needs to thrive and survive. And it's from there that it became a right, that it got turned into the concept that all men, all humans have a right to sustain themselves. And he also mentioned too that many of these natural laws are at variance against, say, human laws, like property laws, for instance. And then there was William of Ockham, about a century, no, I think a century and a half later. William of Ockham, the one who's known for Occam's razor, by the way. And he was in England, and he was one, he had mentioned, I mean, he had delved into the idea too that all men have the right to sustain themselves. And he also added that all temporal rulers needed to be, needed to heed that as they were governing. So this is a sort of a new concept. And, one question that sort of arises is, how much of this really comes, how much of this originated with them, and how much of this was sort of like, say, populist inflected? Because what's really fascinating is about, say about 30 years or 40 years after he's writing this, you have the Peasants Revolt, and this is what's shown on the screen right now with Wat Tyler. Should I give a little rundown of what happened during the 1381 Peasants Revolt? Anyway, I'll get into it. Basically, what had happened was that there was 100 Years' War. They couldn't really, King Richard II couldn't really pay for it, so they decided to raise the taxes, and they imposed poll taxes. Now, previous to that, taxes had always been somewhat progressive, but this time it was a flat tax, so that if you were rich or poor, you paid all the same regardless. Not surprisingly, people were not too happy with that. And so they ended up, people from all over England ended up burning their way down to London to congregate and to talk to Richard II and to convince him to at least to get rid of the poll tax. And they also made moves to saying get rid of serfdom. And, we know that he ended up agreeing to the promises and then reneging upon them. But at the same time, even though he reneged, it was kind of a victory for them in the long run, because the lords did start freeing their serfs. And there were new concepts that are coming around at this time. I think it's the first time you do see this populist rhetoric out in the open. The most famous one, I think, is the one by John Ball, who said, if Adam delved and Eve spin, who then was a gentleman? That's one of his famous quotes. And then all bondmen are made free because God made man free. I think it's one of the most simple and most sublime, quotes I've ever come across. But anyway, this is what's, you have these sort of beginnings, I think, of populist thought. And by the way, I think it's worth pointing out that Paine did admire these radicals, and he did say in The Rights of Man, Part 2, that there should be a statue erected to these people and not just, the barons. He thought that this is a much more important accomplishment than the finding of the Magna Carta. So anyway, there were some popular revolts that, happened after that, prior to, let's say, the Civil War, like the Ketz Rebellion, which was against the, the enclosures. But I think it's the Civil War where you really start to get, I think, a modern consciousness of, populist right. And this is basically, so it's not just about, say, Cromwell going up against, King Charles I for suspending Parliament, or for, say, grabbing properties, but it's also about many of these commoners telling Cromwell, saying, yes, you are, launching a revolution against. I don't think these are the exact words, but you are opposing him. But at the same time, there's so much that needs to be done for, common people. And this is where you have the New Model Army, and then you have, John Lilburne, basically the head of the rebels. I didn't really like that title at all, but they used it anyway. And you have them, I think, for the first time claiming that, wishing for universal male suffrage. They stipulated that everyone should be free, again, everyone should be equal before the law. That there should also be, free trade, because I think up with Charles I, there were still, quite a few monopolies. So this is what's going on. And then you have the true levelers, and these were the diggers, by the way. And they were the ones who most famously wanted to turn the common lands over to the people and have them set up their own farms and cottages. And what's fascinating about that is that many of the people actually did support their endeavors, but not surprisingly, the elites are very, very much opposed to it. And it's worth mentioning some of the quotes here, which I think are fascinating. Okay. Oh, yeah, I should add here, one of the levelers had said, the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. And then the diggers have noted that the government we have gives freedom and livelihood to the gentry to have abundance and to lock up treasures of the earth from the poor, so that rich men may have chests full of gold and silver and houses full of corn and goods to look upon. And the poor that works to get it can hardly live, and if they cannot work like slaves, then they must starve. And it's worth mentioning here that these concepts were not completely new, because they were observations made by Thomas More and by Gilpin. The latter claimed, mighty men, gentlemen, and all rich men intended to rob and spoil the poor. So at this point, you probably wonder, what does this have to do with Thomas Paine? What's going on here basically is that you had the levelers and the diggers, who were the most extreme and whom were, I guess you could say, both feared and hated by Cromwell. And so they were pushed underground, kind of the Jacobins would be, in 1791. We'll get to that later. And at the same time, you had the Quakers who were emerging too. And they were, actually, as you said, the Quakers are part of this, huge group of, many, numerous, these radical new sects, and they're just one of them. And many of these levelers and diggers turned Quaker. John Lilburne, and I guess Gerrard Winstanley, who was the leader of the diggers, also turned Quaker as well too. And then there were a few other men, like I think John Wildman, Benjamin Froley. Many of these people they had connections with the Quakers and the levelers. And it's here where I wonder if Thomas Paine, whose father was a Quaker, if the Quakers had been imbibed all of these notions from the diggers and levelers about, about the equal rights, about concern for the poor, which are actually the Quakers are best known for. So it's kind of interesting. And it's also fascinating that there's actually one printer in London by the name of Thomas Paine as well, too. And he had actually published both leveler and digger tracts. And the interesting thing about him is he spells his name was an E, but our Thomas Paine did not spell it was an E, at least in the beginning. So we have no idea if it was a, relative of the Paines or not, but it's quite interesting. So at this time you have, the Quakers who are also influencing, the levelers and the Quakers who are also influencing the new Republican speakers, new writers of this, the 1550s and 60s, men like, not 50s, 1660s and 70s, men like James Harrington, who wrote Oceana, which is kind of an allegory of England. And then you have Algernon Sidney as well, too. So, even though they don't make any reference to levelers, any clear references to them, I think that they're still very much influenced by them. And I would say, for instance, in Oceana, this is where Harrington talks about how there should be limits on wealth, on landed wealth that can be, I think, of rented properties. The sums that can be earned. He said there should be no more than 2,000, and that anytime you have drastic inequality, it is going to destroy the government. And then then after that you have Algernon Sidney, who is of course probably the most vocal Republican, and he was probably the most vocal about I guess opposing hereditary government. And I would also say too that, like the levelers, he was also concentrating this idea of novelty. Actually, I should say we probably need to flip to that picture of the levelers saying no way to the old way, because that's the next one. Yes, that's the one. This is actually an anti-leveler cartoon, but it does in many ways sort of summarize the way that they thought about embracing modernity. And Algernon Sidney did this follow this sort of line of thought as well too. And so up to this point, and I think with John Locke, you have this sort of acceptance of a monarchy, because this is after the restoration of Charles II. And so for some time, I think there's this acceptance of, of monarchy and of the way things are for some time. I mean, especially with the Jacobite rebellions in 1715 and 1745. But what's interesting is that, so all these things, these ideas are just sort of like lying dormant. No one's talking about republicanism, talking about religious toleration, but most of these other ideas that were mentioned with the levelers have kind of disappeared from view. But they sort of begin to surface in the 1760s, when John Wilkes, was the ascension of George III. What basically happened at this time was that he had appointed Lord Bute as his prime minister, and Lord Bute had gotten rid of many of the Whigs in the preceding administrations, and the Whigs were not happy about that. So they got John Wilkes, who was sort of a new youngish MP, to sort of take action by publishing one of his, he decided to go and publish this sort of bi-weekly, the North Briton, which is very critical of George III and Lord Bute. I mean, to the point that he was sent to the Tower for number 45. There was an infamous number 45 where he questioned both of these leaders and saying that they were not doing anything proper, and that they were actually being seditious. And I think this is because of the failed peace treaty with France in 1762 or so. So at this time when Wilkes is doing this general, he was given a general warrant, and actually at this time the general warrant was not really a very uncommon thing if you wrote against the government. But he turned this into a much bigger affair by claiming that this is like, he was turning this into this I guess you could say class conflict, saying that people needed to take a side because the king and aristocracy were taking their actions against common people. They were, they were locking them up, and we need to do something better. So this is I think it's when the first sort of populist consciousness arises. This is about 1763. I think his trial was in 64. I can't remember exactly. But then, and then after this, you have a whole host of these other new reformist writers, publishing. Like, for instance, there's James Murray, who wrote his infamous Sermons to Asses, and he's supposed to be the most incendiary writer before Thomas Paine. And his book, Sermons to Asses, basically begins with, we hear of the ass kind preaching of mankind. So why should mankind not preach to the ass kind? And this is, by the way, the next slide, the Sermons to Asses. This is really a collection of his writings, which was done in 1819 and edited by radical William Home. But anyway, so in 1768, he's writing this, and Murray is talking about how the taxes are not fair because they're all imposed on things like candles, soap, leather, basic necessities, and whereas the rich are barely taxed at all. So he's talking about that. He's complaining about religious toleration as well too. And it's worth pointing out here that James Murray was actually a Newcastle activist. And for some reason, his ideas must have resonated with many people, because it went through like about 5 editions in England, and then also spread over to the American colonies as well too, and went through several editions as well. And it's worth pointing out too that he, along with many of these reformers writing in the 1760s and 1770s, like for instance James Burgh, many of them were also very much attuned to the American Revolution, and were very much, War of Independence. They were very much sympathetic towards the needs of the colonists. And even though the American colonists were not claiming for independence, I think that they were supportive of at least their kind of concerns, and they understood why the American colonists were angry about the British government. So at this time around, let's see, a few years later, you have John Cartwright publishing his Letters on American Independence, and he's wishing for America to still belong to Britain, but to have sort of a federalist sort of policy where Americans can legislate for themselves. And then later on, he goes on to take this sort of idea of, taxation without representation and apply it to Britain. And he ends up becoming the sort of the leader of the universal suffrage movement, the taxation without representation, saying that all men deserve the right to vote. and that if you pay taxes, you have every right to have a say in your government. So he's writing about this. James Burgh is also writing about this in his huge political dispositions. This is a 3-volume work, which Paine had actually quoted. I'm not sure if he read the entire thing, but we know that he was at least familiar with it, although we're not sure if he was familiar with, say, Cartwright's Letters on American Independence, even though he was the first to advocate it when he arrived in America. So anyway, you have James Burgh's political dispositions, where he complains about the hold of the wealthy on the government, and about, for instance, how many of these younger sons have these jobs, these really well compensated jobs with the government, while doing nothing at all. And he complains about the taxes as well too. Let me see if there's. Let's see. And I think I just want to point out, for instance, he uses a very, very strident language. Every industrious subject has a right at least to complain where he sees the fruit of his labor devoured by a set of overgrown bloodsuckers. Such are all those placemen and pensioners who receive on any pretense of any of the public money in times of public exigency. And it's worth pointing out too, as well, that there were other writers, not just these very visible reformers like Cartwright, and Murray and Burgh, who are writing about it, but the economist Sir John Sinclair discusses this as well too in one of the works that Paine actually quotes from. In the History of Public Revenue, he says in here, the landed interest endeavored to throw off the burden of the state from their own shoulders by stipulating that no money should be raised upon land without the special leave of the House. And the German visitor, Augustus Wendelborn, had also noted too that the British paid insufficient regard to the different classes of people and their circumstances, particularly with problems of inequality and poverty. And then one writer wondered, is not the air we breathe, the ground we tread on, and the food we eat taxed to maintain a regular system of political corruption, to support the administrators of our government and their innumerable dependents in the most enormous extravagance of pomp and luxury? Why then to the poor alone be envied a trivial portion of that wealth, so profusely dissipated by ourselves? So what you have so far, this is, again, we have this, in the 1760s to the 1770s, this really sharply rising consciousness that inequality is a serious problem. You have this consciousness that there should be something better. And I think this is why, when the French Revolution comes about, that there was just such an enthusiastic response to it in 1789. And so here, what happens is that, to backtrack a little, at this time, around the 1780s, with the ending of with the ending of the American Revolution and the beginning of the French Revolution, Paine has sort of become a gentleman of leisure. He's just gotten a farm from from the New York government, New Rochelle. He's working on his various scientific projects like a smokeless candle and a single span iron bridge. And this is the project that really sort of occupies his attention for at least from about 1785 through 1787. And because he couldn't get funding for it in the US, he decided to go over to, he was recommended to go to France by Benjamin Franklin, by the way, who was the same man who had recommended him to go over to America in the first place in 1773. No, sorry, 1774. Anyway, when he's in France, he's trying to get his bridge erected, and he's facing a lot of competition, including from Beaumarchais, the playwright, the one who wrote Barber of Seville and the Marriage of Figaro, and who had also supported the American Revolution. So Paine decides to sort of, he sort of waits it out, and he goes to England. He goes back home where he discovers that his father has died, and he's going about getting patents for his bridge. And this is where he meets Burgh. He becomes friends with Burgh, and at this time, he was, very good terms, because he knew that Burgh was one of the supporters of the American Revolution. And so they go together to visit some iron foundries, and Burgh also writes to one of his friends that, Paine is not interested in politics at all right now. He's just interested in, getting his bridge built. So at this time, when Paine is in England, he's also making several trips back and forth between there and France. And he's learning all about everything that is going on in France its own, because this time Thomas Jefferson was the minister to France. They weren't referred to them as, I think, ambassadors. But anyway, he was minister to France, and he was catching up on all the news of the Estates Generals and how how they had merged into three. He's finding out from Lafayette as well too about about everything that's sort of developing there. So he's enthusiastic. But finally, when when the fall of the Bastille happens, he writes excitedly to Burgh, and Burgh is not really sure what to make, but I think some months later he's just completely shocked. This is especially after Paine writes and says, we need a revolution in Britain too. And Burgh basically writes like this, oh, no, we should. This is like the worst idea possible. And so meanwhile, Burgh is musing upon this, and he becomes more and more horrified. He has a speech about this in Parliament, I think in early 1790. And then there's a young Frenchman who writes to him and asks his opinion on the French Revolution. And so basically, this is where Burgh sets up and writes his reflections on the revolution in France. Now, I should say here that in a way, we're not really sure exactly who he's reacting to. I mean, for all we know, he could have been reacting to, say, Paine's enthusiasm. Many people have assumed that he was probably responding to Richard Price's discourse on the love of our country, and because he does make several references, because he is addressing him in his reflections on the revolution. And basically, Burke's major points in there are that, he argues that, okay, the Glorious Revolution and the French Revolution are not alike in any way, shape, or form. Because he tells Price that the Glorious Revolution was about defending ancient liberties. And what's interesting about that is that actually, if you read that actual bill from 1688, there's a short passages that mentions rights, no less than 5 times. Just one paragraph was like, five references to rights. So you could say that Burgh was kind of off here. And he goes on to say that the French should not be diminishing for the king's powers. They should retain their aristocracy. They should retain the church. I mean, they should not disestablish the church. I just think it's worth mentioning some quotes here. I mean, here he refers to the nobility as the Corinthian capital of polished society. And when he's lamenting the disestablishment of the church, he observes that the consecration of the church by a state religious establishment operates with a wholesome awe upon free citizens. And then, of course, there's just a famous passage about chivalry, about the passing of chivalry. This is the whole problem with the French Revolution, as he said, that they're rejecting their past, their history. He says, I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from the scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. And then he also, very interestingly, he also denies man's quote unquote abstract right to food and medicine. Basically says that all government should do is just have sufficient restraint on the passions. And then, of course, he famously dismisses rights of man in 34 times. The whole concept of rights. And basically, just to summarize it, he says, there's no need for the paltry shreds of paper about the rights of man. When we fear God, we look up with awe to kings, with reverence to priests, and with respect to nobility. This is not to say that he was completely opposed to the idea of reform. He says, for instance, that birth does not necessarily need to be a consideration, but it's always nice to have it. So anyway, a lot of these reformers, when they're reading Burgh, they're floored, because they had always thought that Burgh was one of them, because he was aligned with Charles James de Fox. He had previously, he supported the the American Revolution. He had supported the dissenters for the most part. And he was at this time, no, he had actually just sort of begun launching this case against Warren Hastings for his corruption in as the governor of Bengal. So, he was viewed very much as a liberal for his time. So when he published this, he shocked just pretty much anyone and everyone. So basically you had Mary Wollstonecraft, of course, the first modern feminist, right? She writes The Vindication of the Rights of Men. She's the first one. And then there are and numerous others, including Joseph Priestley. There's Catherine Macaulay. There's a dissenter, Capel Loft, John Tower. Anyway, they're all furious about Burgh, but it's not until Paine comes along that the whole debate takes on a completely different level, because Paine is just much, much more, as we'll see, much more radical. Paine really begins by saying, addressing the whole concept of rights. Let me see. I think if you want to move on to the next slide, perhaps that might help. Okay, sorry. This is Richard Price and Edmund Burke. I should have described this earlier. And it's a really fascinating cartoon, because you have it's supposed to be anti-Price, but what's fascinating here is that Burke looks like a much more threatening figure holding up his Reflections on the Revolution of France than does Richard Price. And by the way, if you notice in the background, I think that's supposed to be a painting of the beheading of Charles I. So anyway, if you want to go past this one as well too. Okay, so this is the rights of man. So basically, Paine begins by saying that, men are of all one degree. They're all born equal with equal natural right. And he insists that mankind were originally equals in the order of creation, pointing out that male and female are the distinctions of nature, good and bad, the distinctions of heaven. And by declaring that the equality of man, so far from being a modern doctrine, is the oldest upon record, he not only upends potential allegations of innovation, but any sense of sort of like national privilege, especially since like many Britons at this time, like say Cartwright, and there are other and his cohorts, Sir Christopher Wivell, they're all sort of harking back to the idea of the ancient Saxon democracy. Now all this had changed with the arrival of William the Conqueror. So anyway, here's Paine saying for the first time, I'm just laying it out that rights are important. And so using that rationale, he goes on to contest the idea of birth. This, if God makes everyone equal, why should anyone be more important than another just because of extrinsic personages, like who he's born to, etc. And it's where he talks about how not just that the aristocracy is wrong, not just because of how it exists, but also the whole idea of primogeniture, which, by the way, is something that Mary Wollstonecraft had criticized as well, doing her Vindication of the Rights of Men. And Thomas Paine actually uses this sort of one very Goya-esque image that, it's sort of like throwing up, it's a family adopting, holding one child while eating the rest up. And he goes on to say that the reason why aristocratic government is wrong is because when these heirs are raised with all these expectations and being treated and groomed as the only ones who matter, that's the way they're going to govern. So they're only going to govern for themselves. And then that's what he mentions, I think in a much clearer way than other writers, that this is why the taxes are much higher on common goods, because aristocrats are making it. I mean, they are just benefiting themselves. They're the ones who are governing. And so this is the reason why land taxes have not changed at all through the century. And in fact, it's probably gone down because their lands, I mean, their values were for some reason devalued. But things like, taxes on, on basic necessities, well, all the ones that James Murray mentioned, all of these were rising, things like, beer and gin. And he mentions there as well, too, like, for instance, because the aristocracy can brew their own, beer and wine and whatnot, they don't have to pay any extra taxes when they purchase, when they consume it. But ordinary people do, because they have to buy it at the tavern or pub or anywhere else. So he goes on. And then he also goes on and criticizes the way the government is set up, saying that there is really no British Constitution at all, and because there's no real separation of power to begin with, because the king exercises great influence on Parliament, on the Prime Minister at least, and so there's no significant boundary between any of them, and that there's just lots of influence. And by the way, it's worth mentioning that I think modern constitutional scholars like Bernard Bognador and Anthony King have also spoken about this. And I think they've also mentioned, others have also mentioned this around the time of Brexit, saying that, this is the reason why Brexit's not working out, because there's no clear delineation of power. I mean, between the Prime Minister and Parliament. So Paine's ideas in here are, I think, a step up in radicalism from, say, all the other respondents to Burgh. But it's not until part 2 that he gets really, really radical, especially chapter 5. This is the one where he famously, advocates, national assistance for the poor, because up to then, the poor laws were such that depending on where you lived in the country, you could get different sums of paid to you, because it depended on whatever tax rates you paid in each parish. And so he says that there should be a nationalized way of dealing with it. And the solutions that he's proposing at this time are at least, I think, several times as much as what some of the highest payouts some of the parishes were getting. So Paine is much more generous, and he's also advocating that, for instance, the elderly, there needs to be something done about that, because there are many people who are working into their, their 60s, 70s, and even 80s, and that there should be some provision for them. And he said this is where he comes up with a sort of idea for, like, what we would call Social Security here in the U.S. And he mentions that, since you pay taxes, why don't you get them back when you're starting when you're 50 and then getting a larger sum when you're 60. So this is one of his ideas. And then he also advocates that he would like to see all of Europe turn into to adopt Republican governments. And he's advocating that, because of that, his argument is that Republican governments are less warmongering than, say, monarchies. And so with such a case, you could have sort of alliance of all these different nations. It's sort of a very NATO-like idea. And because you no longer have these monarchies, they can just pool all these military resources together. So he goes on to talk, and so there'll be fewer military. And then, of course, if you have no monarchy, you wouldn't have a civil list or any of these payouts. So that would be another thing eliminated. And and then, of course, he also talks about not compulsory education, but he's saying that there really should be as many schools as possible. And it's funny because today, I think there are modern conservatives who say, oh, well, Paine is saying that we should get vouchers. So he probably wanted charter schools. But the thing is, like, there wasn't even such an idea back then. Paine just really wanted to have as many poor people get education as possible. And it's, by the way, it is a very radical idea, because even in the 1820s, when people were discussing that idea of compulsory education, many of the gentry and aristocracy are opposed to it, because they're thinking, well, they might become dissatisfied with their own condition, and this is very dangerous. So anyway, what happens is that you have chapter 5 being sort of the Paine's most radical, most radical ideas. But I should add, by the way, that, prior to that, and he becomes much more anti-monarchical as well. I think This is partly because of the fact that Louis the 16th had tried to escape from Francis's family, and he was brought back, and it was clear that he did not support the revolution. So this is really when Paine had advocated to the French that why don't we just get rid of the monarchy, period. And it's fascinating to note that Paine was actually one of the first, because even what we consider the most radical Jacobins, like say Robespierre, they were opposed to the idea of getting rid of monarchy. They only adopted that, say, later on. So what happens after part two? It is huge. It turned out to be a huge hit in England. It's one thing is that it's selling for 6 pence, as opposed to say 3 shillings, which part one sold it. And so it's much more popular. It's very accessible, to everyone. And this is really when William Pitt the Younger, the prime minister, becomes very much alarmed. And of course, all the aristocrats, they're writing to him saying, what should we do? Paine's, we're finding Paine's pamphlet everywhere. And you see all these coal miners holding onto copies of it. What should we do? And so this is where William Pitt decides to to basically send Paine to trial, and then at the same time to declare seditious libel for any dangerous publications. And he originally sets up Paine's trial for, I think, June 8th, 1792. And he decides against it because he's afraid that it's going to make a martyr out of Paine. And at the same time, Paine has been sort of elected he becomes an honorary citizen of France, and he becomes elected to their National Assembly. So he goes there in September, but only after, I think, his friend William Blake tells him at Joseph Johnson's dinner, warns him that the government is after you. You better escape to France now. And it's a really fascinating episode because he takes his fast coach over to Dover, and the government is hot on his heels, and they're examining all of his writings and everything, and he is able to sort of escape. We think at least that they probably let him go because they didn't want him to cause any more trouble, and they didn't want any kind of I guess they didn't want him to become a martyr, during his trial. So they sort of let him go, and they're throwing stones and everything at him. So at least sort of Paine is sort of like saved at this moment. And so this is where we end up with the Rights of Man Part 2. By the way, I should add that because it's such a popular work, William Pitt also decides to assign these sort of like negative biographies written on Paine, and also decides to have the writer Hannah More write tracts for the common people in the style of Paine, but advocating sort of the support for the government. So I'm ready to take any questions.
Sorry, you threw me there slightly. We've got more pictures to come. Are you wanting to use the rest of the slides?
Yes. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yes, I did want to mention the one with Cobbett and the bones.
Okay, let's just head back into them.
Oh, I see. We still have some time. It's going to great.
Okay.
Okay, this is a cartoon. I think you've probably seen this, right? From I think it's December 1792. Yeah.
We have a copy in the library, actually. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. Yeah. Okay, so you probably know what it's all about. The figures at the head are Charles James Fox and Joseph Priestley. And by the way, it's worth mentioning that Charles James Fox was pretty much a defender of the revolution, but he did not support Paine at all. And it's a really fascinating, it's a really intriguing cartoon because it is supposedly on the side of the government. Okay, I mean, it looks like, because Gilray had sort of become a sort of cartoonist for the government. But what's interesting about this one too is that in some ways there's more sympathy for Paine, at least, because those figures, and I mean the judges' wigs look absolutely horrifying in there. This is at least pointed out in Emma Clary's book on the rise of supernatural fiction, 1760 to 1790. And I thought, that makes sense, with, especially with all the gallows and everything. And then here is, this is, I think, from January the 1st, 1793. I'm not exactly sure of the dates here. This portrait of Paine, I think, is modeled of, obviously, the famous one by William Sharp, the one that we always see. And if you notice here, his name is spelled Paine without an E. And it's probably a pun on Paine, but it is interesting because it's also the way his name was originally spelled, because he didn't add E until he arrived in America. And so I think with the next picture, this is, of course, this, goes to the very end of his life. You have Paine buried in New Rochelle. He wants to be buried with the Quakers, but the Quakers won't allow him at all. So he's buried in his own backyard. And meanwhile, William Cobbett, who was very, very much opposed, he used to be conservative, conservative Tory. He was very much opposed to Paine. And later on, he had a change of heart, thinking that, Paine was actually right after all this criticism of government. So he decided to go to America. He had his two sons, and they dug up Paine's bones and brought them back. And
we have a fantastic project called Bones of Paine, where we commemorated the bicentenary of that happening. And Paine's bones.
I saw pictures of that.
Yeah, nearly coming to Manchester, certainly coming as far as Salford. So yeah, we know all about that round here. It's an extraordinary story, though.
Yeah. I think the story was that he was supposedly going to have a huge procession with flowers strewn everywhere, and then George III died, and so they had to cancel everything. That's what I read in, I think.
Well, certainly in terms of the coming into Manchester, the authorities told Cobbett in no uncertain terms he was not to come, and they had kind of got yeomanry guarding the bridges so that he couldn't get across from Salford into Manchester.
Oh, wow.
So at that point, he turned away from Manchester and he went to Coventry instead, and the bones were displayed there, and then he went on to London. So yeah, that was our commemoration 200 years late, but we've got Thomas Paine's bones metaphorically into Manchester.
Yes. And I think that after that, what's really fascinating too is that he, I think Cobbett started running for Parliament. And I don't know if it was because of that he sort of dropped the whole Paine project, but he basically made him a literal, skeleton in the closet. And he locked it up in there for some time. And I think when his son went bankrupt, they were going through everything, and he wanted to sell Paine's bones, but the auctioneer said, sorry, we can't sell human parts. So it was just left there. And then that's when I think no one really knows what exactly happened to the bone. It's like it was probably made into buttons, God knows what. So anyway, I think the question, was this picture. What I wanted to bring up is that I think what's fascinating is that even though, Paine was, of course, writing Rights of Man, both parts for England. It was really specifically written for them. He didn't think that America would have such a problem. And by the way, it was the same with Jefferson as well, because everyone, I think, and even modern economists have said that colonial America was much less, had much less inequality than than Europe did. So he thought that this was only applicable to, to England, and really to, I guess, to the rest of Europe. And I think for me, an interesting irony is the fact that many of these countries, at least in Europe, and at least still in England, you still have a monarchy, you still have an aristocracy, but at the same time, you have more of a sort of public safety net that Paine advocated than we do in America. This is what I find completely ironic. And what is fascinating too is that, we don't have quote unquote true, hereditary government in the US. And yet what we have is, we still have this situation where, many kids end up becoming senators if the parents were senators. And, sometimes if wives also assume that as well too. It's funny how we in America have not really learned the lessons of Paine. And we have a problem here as well too, where money plays a huge role in our elections. And so you have like the wealthiest people exerting that much more control. And at the same time, too, I mean, like if you look at the members of Congress, they have a much, much, much higher, I think, net worth than ordinary citizens do. So to me, it's fascinating as an American that we in America have ended up with a lot of what Paine was complaining about in 18th century England. I mean, we still have it. We, pretty much have an oligarchical government, and that's what we have. That's what we saw that other slide. Get money out of politics because we're in the same situation that 18th century England was in.
Okay, so on that note, I can see there are things in the chat, so let me have a quick whiz through that. Right, so Frank asks, if colonial America had less inequality than Europe, what about the slaves?
Okay, that's a good question. Yes, slaves should be, I guess, taken out of this equation. We're just talking about white men here, primarily white men, not even women so much. And I should also bring up that, one of the things that has, I think, disturbed many, I guess, liberals too, is that people have wondered why Paine never wrote about slavery and about women's rights in Rights of Man. It's a good question. I don't know why, but I think if we sort of read back what he wrote in the case of the excise officers that he wrote in, if you think back to what he wrote in the case of the excise officers in 1774, he says in there that the rich just do not understand poverty or need at all. We can sort of understand where he's coming from because he says later on, someone had asked him, why don't you write about slavery? And he says that, he really did. It makes him angry, but he doesn't know how to write about it because he has no experience with it. And he advocates that slaves should actually the ones who are literate should write about their experiences. That would be most effective coming from them. And at this time, especially was part two, Mary Wollstonecraft was writing her Vindication of the Rights of Women. So it's possible that maybe he didn't want to, they were friends. Possibly he didn't want to tread on her, on her line of thought and thought maybe it's just better to have her talk about this than have me who knows nothing about this or, next to nothing about it. So I think that may be why Paine doesn't. And there's also a question, of course, about, Paine's friendship with slave owners like, say, the Lawrences, and of course, Jefferson. I mean, did he ever say anything to them about freeing their slaves? It's a really good question. And yet his nemesis to be, George Washington, he was the one who ended up freeing his slaves. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, unfortunately, all these remarks on inequality, I think this refers to, to white men. And the fact, by the way, it's worth mentioning that Britain did not have slavery. And that the whole abolition movement was sort of like an attempt to, I think, reinstate that fact.
Well, that sounds like the topic of another debate yes. entirely. But now you mentioned rights of women there a bit, but we've got another question. Could you give a steer on Paine's view of the rights of women?
He has a very interesting article about in the Pennsylvania magazine. It's called The Occasional Letter to the Female Sex. It's actually, it's actually a article written by a Frenchman. But I think the fact that Paine tried to incorporate it into his Pennsylvania magazine says a lot for him. But yeah, unfortunately, he really says very, very little about women. I think there's one reference to them in Rights of Man, Part 2, and this is where he talks about how, if you had more schools, you could have more clergymen's widows teaching. So obviously, I mean, we can infer from that he was not opposed to women working.
Okay, and somebody's asking about references to Paine in US politics today.
Oh, okay, that is a really great question. What's fascinating with that is that the people who are really trying to make use of Paine today, or at least for the last 40, 50 years, have actually been conservatives, starting with Ronald Reagan, as I think I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk. And it was ironic that he used Paine's phrase that we have the power to begin the world over again, he uses that in connection with the Star Wars military policy. So it is very ironic. And then you had later on, I think in 2008, you had people like Glenn Beck trying to co-opt Paine's common sense. And I would say what is really, it's what's funny about that is that they're trying to co-opt the sense of we need a smaller government. We don't need such a large and intrusive one. But it's kind of a misinterpretation because at least back then in the colonial days, people, including Paine himself, I think wanted a larger government. The small government that was really more a reference to Britain, and it was actually very, very anti-elitist too, because I think we mentioned with James Murray that they had all complained about all these positions, taken up by the younger sons of aristocrats, and they were the ones who were earning all the money and basically getting tax payments from the public for doing very, very little. And so this is what was meant really by bloated government. And it's ironic that today, I think that, you have these modern conservatives trying to make this excuse so that they can have the wealthy pay fewer taxes.
Now, would anyone like to wave at me to ask a question? I am looking at, you can put one in the chat or you can wave at me. I'm thinking we may be drawing to a close. So we've covered it. We've covered a lot. We've covered a lot today. Thomas Paine, as many of you know, is a great hero of our founders, Ruth and Eddie Frau. We have a fantastic Paine collection, as has been put in the chat. So if you're anywhere near the library, we would love you to come in and read some early editions of Thomas Paine. There is nothing like holding a book from 1791 in your hands. Please do come if you can. Obviously, that's going to be harder for Francis, but if ever you're in this country, Francis, we would love to see you in 3 dimensions. Thank you.
I tell you, when I read about this, I thought, I wish I'd been there when I was, in Oxford for those 7 years. I'd never heard about this. I thought, what an idiot.
Well, we're often called Salford's hidden gem, and it's my personal mission to delete the word hidden from that phrase. Great, because we really want people to know about us and come and use us. So it has been great to be able to broaden out our knowledge of us via these Zoom talks. So thank you very much indeed, Francis, for helping us do that. We will be putting this up on YouTube later, so do let other people know, and we will be back next week, Wednesday, the 26th of May. We're welcoming Terry Dunn, and he will be speaking to us on land and labour, the agrarian question in the Irish Revolution, 1913 to 23. He'll be joining us from Ireland, but we're going to be back to our usual 2 p.m. time slot next week, and we hope that you can join us. So yeah, we've recorded this. We'll be putting the link to the YouTube version onto the event webpage. And a final reminder, as usual, our talks are free, but if you feel able to support the library, we would love to do that. And thank you very much to those of you who do that very regularly. We do appreciate that. There's a donate button on our website. Thank you again, and goodbye until the same time next week. Yeah, thank you very much, Francis. Take care. In solidarity. Very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.